invested in this and to help you to get the bay to where we know it needs to be. So for love of the bay, I hope you will tell your story. All of us have that story, and it can help us shape the bay's future. And some of you might say that it's not your job to do the science, or it's only your job to do the science, and not your job to tell the story, that's for the outreach officer at your institution or a communications specialist, and you just give the background information for them. But we all certainly have our strengths and weaknesses and our comfort zones, but you being at this conference demonstrates the fact that you already understand the need to tell your story and to hear the stories of other people. And so if you are willing to do that within the walls of the scientific community, it's very important for you all to do that outside those walls. For me, and if our future is to be informed by this science that you all are working on, we have to get very good at telling our stories so that the impact of your work is not just confined by this conference, that it has a broader impact, and you're able to extend the work that you're doing beyond these walls. So many of us feel innately this comic. Cards for scientists from their non-scientist relations. I definitely heard all of these things throughout my PhD from my parents, and it's frustrating sometimes because we all have an understanding of the work that we are doing, and it's very difficult to make that work relevant in a way that other people can understand. And that's really because science often doesn't make sense. And so that's why you have to make sure your story does. And in the Chesapeake Bay community, one of the easiest examples of the fact that science really doesn't make sense is if you are to tell somebody unfamiliar with the Bay and with the TMDL that pollution that people do in New York and in Pennsylvania could have a greater impact on the health of the Bay than the pollution that people are putting into the water in Virginia, that doesn't make sense. And so to make sure that you are telling your story in a way that is relevant and that people understand, you have to be creative in your storytelling capacity and be willing to pare back on some of the nuance. So for instance, if I was to tell you all the kind of research that I did when I was back at VIMS, I could nail it down in 3 easy bullet points. One is that I utilize multiple models to help us understand the deficiencies and strengths within each individual model. Then 2, I used that understanding of multiple models to kind of examine the impact of regulatory nutrient reductions and climate change's impact on water quality. And then 3, I combine that understanding of multiple models and then the impact of nutrient reductions and climate change to get us a better understanding of how confident we are that our efforts to improve water quality in Bay will actually work. Now, all those words and that kind of story makes a lot more sense in this context, but if I was to tell that on the Hill, as people ask me to tell my story there, they would glaze over. And it's not just because or it's not at all because they're not interested in my work, but I haven't made it relevant for them. And so it took me a while, but I finally swallowed the nuance pill. And now I tell people that think back to hurricane tracks. So you see the squiggly lines and the cone of uncertainty. And I basically do that for the coastal ocean. But instead of looking at where the hurricane's going to be in a few days, I'm looking at what is going to be the health of our ocean in a few years. And that gets rid of a lot of the nuance. It's a completely imperfect analogy. I fully understand that. But it helps provide a sense of grounding for me to then go into further detail once they provide questions to me. So if we are to figure out how that kind of detail should work for that individual audience, this comic I also think is wonderful. Suggested methods of presenting your findings. There's a bunch of good ones on there, but I think the best is the strategy of whispering into a hole in an enchanted oak. I find that works quite well. And so I encourage you all to try it as well. But really what we're trying to do is go back to the basics to find something that people value and that people understand, and then draw the comparison from there. So go back to the hurricane modeling. People understand those hurricane tracks. They see them quite often. So I can ground it in that and then draw a comparison so that I can provide the greater context of the work that I want to do. And one of the problems, though, that we have in the scientific community when we're doing this is that very often we call this dumbing it down. And I want to be clear, if you get anything from this talk today, it's that you aren't dumbing it down, you're making it relevant. Dumbing it down does a disservice to not just you, but also the person you are trying to give this information to. And what we're really trying to do is ensure that we are making our science as relevant as possible, making our story accessible, and making it mean something to the people that we are trying to get them to engage on this. Scientists are very bad at this because I think it's because a lot of us don't want to be seen as stupid or vulnerable in our science. But you already do that quite well within the walls of the scientific community. Here you're at this research conference, giving your talk and telling your story. People are going to ask you hard questions, and you're okay with that, and you understand how to address those. When I was doing my research, as I said, I used multiple models. A lot of those models came from other scientists and other labs where they were working on answering different questions with those models. But they gave me that model output, allowed me to skill assess their models, compare their model to other models, identify where the deficiencies are, which ones are stronger and do better in what cases, and which ones do worse, so that we have a better understanding of how to make everybody's models better. But that is inherently scary because you're giving me the ability to then publish a paper on the faults of your research and your work. And so our community is already used to having this vulnerability within the walls of science, and it's really important that we then also understand that that vulnerability has to be extended beyond the walls of science. Now, there's definitely a time and place for nuance. You don't always have to immediately make it relevant and leave it there. And in my role currently as a policy advisor, I'm always having to juggle how much nuance to provide. And my rule of thumb is provide the least amount possible and then allow the person that you're talking to ask the questions, so that then you can inform them based on their understanding as opposed to you presuming their understanding. So as we are not dumbing it down, we're trying to make it relevant here at this conference, and as we're practicing telling our stories here, how do we make this TMDL research relevant? Well, the conference has laid out these 5 big challenges that the TMDL is facing as we enter the 3rd decade of the 21st century. These are some massive questions, and all of your work is dealing with one or multiple of these, and they all interact with each other. We can't understand what the magnitude of nutrient reductions are going to be with climate change if we don't have the proper observation and modeling. Our management decisions cannot be informing how we address living resources if we don't know what the level and success of our current efforts have been. So all of these are interacting with each other, and they are critical scientific questions to address so that we can understand what the challenges are as we move forward. But if we want to make these relevant, I think we have to add some other challenges to this. Some challenges that allow you to impose a lens of broader relevance onto these questions and to your research. So the first is politics. Now, when I'm talking politics, this is at the federal level, the state level, the local level. It's about local economics, and there is a hesitancy among a lot of the scientific community to not make the environmental work and the research you're doing political, but it is inherently political. It is about limited resources. It's about making decisions of who gets what and who doesn't. But while something is political, it doesn't always have to be partisan. And so I think that is a strong distinction that we should be making, to not shy away from the politics, because it informs everything that we are doing, but you can take a level away and not be partisan about it. And so there's some things that we need to be thinking about as we try and apply a political lens to the work we're doing. For instance, with the TMDL specifically, you have all the lawsuits. Since the beginning of the TMDL, it has been mired in litigation of whether the EPA had the authority to do what, or whether states can force other states to do things. And most recently, you have Maryland, Virginia, and DC threatening to sue the EPA because the EPA is not enforcing the pollution reductions across the watershed. And so the context of these lawsuits is certainly a challenge for the TMDL. If something happens in the lawsuits and the legal underpinnings of the regulation are stripped, then the TMDL is definitely facing a serious challenge. And so that should be informing the work that we're doing. funding. In order for the TMDL to be successful, not only do we have to have the science underpinning it, but there's going to be a lot of money that it takes to actually implement the management strategies that all of you are doing your research on. And this funding is very insecure. The administration has called for cutting funding for the Bay program in its budget proposals, and Congress has said no and provided funding. And that funding uncertainty at the federal level is mirrored also at the state level and the local level, where politics are trying to having to inform who's making decisions of who gets what resources, and is the Bay the key thing that people want to be funding. Then you have the big issue of parochialism. Everybody says, you know, all politics is local. Well, a lot of, and I should say the vast majority of the environmental issues are also local as well. This gets back to that New York versus Virginia example where, you know, New Yorkers and people in Pennsylvania are not next to the Bay. And so the parochial nature of them is that if they're going to have to take an action, they want to see a parochial improvement. And so if you are not thinking about the parochialism of the work that you're doing, it's a disservice to providing relevance to this to other people. This goes beyond just the Bay. Why should a senator from California support funding for something like the Bay program, right? It's not going to impact her constituents immediately, but you know, it's an easy answer. The science and the research that's going on in Chesapeake Bay is at the cutting edge of how one could address these very technical and entrenched challenges of reducing the human impact on our ecosystems. And that can inform what's going on with the challenges of San Francisco Bay or up in Puget Sound. And so learning how to provide that parochial lens on your work can be important. Society. This is about the values of the societies that we live in, the understanding what a society needs and what society cares about, and figuring out what you need to do to get buy-in from that society to support this work. This house begins in trust. Over the past couple decades, there's been quite a few studies that have shown that trust in governmental agencies or the government overall is degrading, and the TMDL in a lot of parts of the region is seen as a government overreach and telling them what they need to do in order to clean up a bay far away. So there is an inherent distrust in the work that is, or the actions that are coming out of the work that you are doing. But where you have an advantage in trust in the society is, as trust in government has gone down over the past few decades, trust in experts and scientific experts in their fields has actually increased. And so again, you moving beyond the walls of the scientific conference to understand that society actually does trust you and that you are a resource that they need to hear from in order to make this TMDL relevant to them, it's incredibly important to feed into this work. You have big societal impacts like COVID-19. And why might this matter for the TMDL? Well, when you have something like COVID-19, what it is really impacting at the state and local level is budgets for communities. And as communities are going to have to refill the lost revenues from the past few months of them not collecting their normal tax bases, states and cities are going to have to make some hard decisions. And does the society value making sure this one thing occurs to backfill it, or do they still want to move forward with that upgrade of the water treatment facility, or that grant program to help local farmers put up repairing buffers, right? It's going to cause society to make some hard decisions, and it could reorient people's priorities away from what they thought it was going to be of helping the Bay. Same is true for the broader crisis of racial justice that the country is trying to tackle right now. And if you don't think that racial justice has an impact on the TMDL, then you are not understanding what people are out there marching for. I obviously can't see everybody here, but normally when you look around the room in these conferences, the makeup of the people that are doing this research on how to save the Bay does not look like the people that live in the Bay region. When you are going out and doing your VIMS does this thing where they send scientists to pubs to help, get that research that you're doing and make it relevant to that community. Are you only going to pubs in those affluent neighborhoods? Are you meeting people where they are and making sure that you are making this science accessible and relevant to the entire community and not just the community that is easiest for you to make it relevant to? And climate change. This isn't the real science climate change, which you are already including in your nutrient reduction efforts, your living resources research, your observation modeling, your management. I'm talking about the big policy level climate change at the highest scale, and then the visceral impact and understanding people have on climate change. For example, when the Green New Deal came out the other year, last year, and there were massive talking points immediately of this visceral reaction of, oh, they want to take away our plains and our cows. That's the kind of climate change impact I'm talking about, not the individual scientific impacts of it. And why is that important? Well, the policy that is shaped at the big national level and at the international level are going to impact the policy decisions that are made at the state and local levels. And as you are trying to inform management decisions that take into account the impacts of climate change, the understanding of what is the larger policy landscape is going to be important. Is the country addressing managed retreat? And are you incorporating that into your modeling framework? Those kind of things. Climate justice. Climate justice is racial justice, and as you look at how you are informing or you're allowing climate change to inform the relevance of your work, you can be thinking about how science sometimes tells us that the exact correct decision is not exactly the one that makes the most sense for community and for redressing the injustices of the past. For example, if you are working on urban planning and the growth of urban centers and trying to figure out the amount of pollution that is going to cause running into the Bay as our urban areas grow over the next 50 years. Well, there are a lot of different strategies for urban areas to address that pollution runoff, to mitigate it as they grow. One of the key ones is creating green space. Urban parks are great at collecting stormwater runoff, at trapping some of that pollution, and so they're a great strategy for reducing runoff. But what they are also really good at is decreasing urban heat effect, increasing local property values, increasing community gathering spaces, increasing local air quality. And what we know is that there are great racial disparities in where green spaces are located, and some of those places are the locations where you have the highest amount of urban water runoff. So you have an opportunity, and through this lens, to tie in a climate justice with your work to make it relevant of why should an urban area care about implementing these kind of strategies to reduce their water runoff when the Bay is miles away and they never go down there. And then scale. Climate change is obviously impacting at the global scale, but also all the way down to the very personal local scale. On recurrent flooding, how are you talking about it? How are you incorporating that into your decision making and understanding? All the way up to the majority of people think about climate change in terms of emissions context, but emissions are not directly relevant to the TMDL. But when people hear about climate change, they're thinking about, oh, greenhouse gases, that kind of pollution. And so understanding the scale of where people are looking at and how they're thinking can help inform the way that we are addressing these issues. And so these are not all separate, they are combined. You cannot take a look at them individually. Similarly to the challenges that we are all doing, you cannot individually address them. Everything is connected, and we can apply this lens to these challenges that we know the TMDL is facing on the science level, but also apply that lens at a higher level to help make our science and our stories much more relevant. And so, for love of the Bay, please tell your very relevant story. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ike. I'm sure everybody's clapping. Unfortunately, we can't hear it. I encourage everyone to go ahead and use the Q&A feature if you have any questions or comments for Ike. And we have one posted from Ray Najar. And I'll just read this to you, Ike. It's a comment. Ray says, "It is really surprising to hear that trust in scientific expertise has been increasing. That is certainly not the impression one gets from the news. I also wonder if there are differences in the level of trust of scientific expertise and its trend between Democrats and Republicans."
So yes, and I will say the trends I'm talking about are on the decade scale, so since roughly the 70s. So there may be some recent blips in that. And so again, scale is important. And there are definitely more recent trends that are partisan trends. And I think the reticence of a lot of scientists to not engage in the politics because they're afraid of being partisan has been part of that issue. If you don't fear engaging in the politics side of things and understand that it doesn't have to be partisan, I think we can hopefully try and mend some of that difference in trust of scientific expertise. But it is a very strong trajectory of an increase in trust in scientific expertise over the past couple decades, and a significant decrease in government trust. So I think those are pretty strong correlations.
Great, thank you, Ike. And we have another question, this one from Denise Wardrop. She says, both storyteller and recipient need to be engaged, and your talk is from the storyteller perspective. What can we do for the story recipients to improve the reciprocity between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is why it's so important to make your story relevant, right? If you are doing your work appropriately, you are going to be engaging that other person where they bring follow-up questions to you. It's also why I think it's so important in the example I gave of programs that go to pubs and tell their science stories. If you're not doing that in every community, not every community is going to be receptive, but if you're not working to try and make sure that you are focusing your efforts across everyone, you're going to be missing the opportunity to be surprised about who might be more receptive to your story than you think. But I don't have a great answer.
Thank you, Ike. Any other questions for Ike or comments? We have another question from a couple of questions. First from Heather Presendance. What advice do you have for current students who want to have an impact on policy? Where do they start? Great question.
Yeah. So I think one easy place to start is you can always contact your representative, whether it's your state or local representative, your congressional representative, your senators. Those contacts matter. We count them all the time. We sort them based on what you're communicating to us about. So we have an understanding of what our constituents care about. So we know that we need to be responsive to them. If you want to go a step further, and obviously I'm saying this from my position as a staffer on the Hill, there are so many organizations that organize scientists, and especially grad students, to come and do lobby days. Now, again, it's not a partisan lobby day. It is a lobby day based on the values of the work that you are doing. So you could come and lobby for science funding overall, or funding for the Chesapeake Bay program in general. And you team up with a group like American Geophysical Union or one of the other scientific societies, and they host these all the time, and they bring scientists in to come talk to people like me, so that I can hear the relevance of the work that you're doing and understand how it might impact the policies that I'm writing. So I think those are two really easy pieces. One, you can do on your own on your computer. Just go to everybody's, all your representatives' websites, and they'll give you an option of how to talk to them, and make sure that they are hearing about you on what your values and your goals are in science.
Thanks, Ike. Okay, and we have a question from Sandy Hertz. She asks, what are some resources, approaches to consider when framing your communication plan?
So I think on the resource side of thing, it's very important for you to continue to be engaged beyond your science in just the broader news of the world. So if you, and it doesn't mean you have to be listening to the news all the time, everywhere, and know everything about the news, but having a broader understanding of some of the things that are going on is very important. And you can do it in your own kind of bubble if you want to stay in science. For instance, you could take a podcast. NPR has a science podcast called Shortwave. It's very short, 12 minutes a day, but it gives you very relevant science stories that can help maybe you connect the relevance of the work you're doing, or hear another person tell a science story and you're like, oh, that's a good idea about how to tell that science story. And that's one way to keep your work relevant. So I think podcasts are a great resource in that sense. But also there's other like news blasts. If you sign up for a morning or even a weekly or monthly alert, depending on how frequently you want the barrage of information, but making sure that you are teaching yourself about more than just the work you're doing can help you more easily discuss your work and connect it to other contexts.